I'll have more reporting about this later at dropsitenews.com. But for now, Republicans in the House yesterday convened a hearing with the headline, Confronting Union Anti-Semitism, Protecting Workers from Big Labor Abuses. Here's Chairman Bob Good at the top of it.
Today's hearing will examine the ways in which unions put politics over people through the lens of rampant union anti-Semitism.
All right, good topic. Let's hear the bill of particulars. What's the rampant anti-Semitism?
Additionally, the response by union leaders to the October 7 Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel have exposed yet another way that unions are beholden to the radical left instead of to the workers they claim to represent.
So yes, this hearing was actually about the war on Gaza, but it gets a lot crazier than just that. Now here's the background, and some news too. On December 1st, the UAW officially called for a ceasefire in Israel, explaining, as one union leader put it, from opposing fascism in World War II to mobilizing against apartheid South Africa and the Contra War, the UAW has consistently stood for justice across the globe. That's why I am proud that the UAW International is today officially calling for a ceasefire in Israel and Palestine. The executive board also voted to form a, quote, divestment and just transition working group to study the history of Israel and Palestine, the union's economic ties to the conflict, and to explore how to achieve a just transition for U.S. workers from war to peace, unquote. Now, that move did not sit well with supporters of the war. The bad news for the UAW is that one of those war supporters happens to be Neil Barofsky, who, as bad luck would have it for those workers, is a federally appointed monitor overseeing a UAW consent decree reached with the Department of Justice. Barofsky has immense power over the UAW because of the fallout of previous corruption scandals which landed 2 UAW presidents in prison. Now, recently, we covered the surprising development that now Fain himself is under investigation by the monitor, Barofsky, who opened a wide probe and was demanding enormous amounts of documents all of a sudden. Now, I noted at the time that it didn't make sense on its face, but more pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together. Now, this is going to sound crazy, but what I'm about to report is actually backed up by a trail of evidence. Here's what's happening. The DOJ's monitor overseeing the UAW is a fierce and outspoken supporter of Israel, and he is retaliating against UAW President Shawn Fain after Fain refused to back off the call for a ceasefire. I told you it would sound crazy, but here's what we know for sure. So after the ceasefire announcement, Barofsky, the DOJ monitor, personally lobbied Fain to retract it. Then in February, he lobbied the entire executive board of the union. So this nugget was first reported last week by the Detroit News, buried in an article under the headline, UAW's court filing highlights tension with federal monitor. Indeed it did. So the paper got a copy of an email sent on February 19th by Benjamin Dichter, an attorney for the union, to Neil Barofsky, the monitor. I also reviewed a copy of that email. It reads in part, on November 30th, 2023, the IEB, the democratically elected governing body of the UAW, debated whether and what position the UAW should take on the crisis in Gaza. This position statement, calling for a ceasefire, was announced the next day and released to the press. Soon thereafter, you called President Fain and introduced your conversation with President Fain as one that was, quote, strictly on a personal level, during which time you shared with President Fain your personal concerns about the union's position on the crisis in Gaza. Your call to President Fain on an issue so blatantly outside of the monitor's jurisdiction was inappropriate, as your office holds disproportionate power over the UAW, and even a, quote, strictly personal sharing of opinion implicitly implicates such power dynamic. Nonetheless, out of respect for you and the office of the monitor, President Fain discussed the conversation with only those in his inner circle and chose not to escalate the improper exchange any further. On February 11, 2024, your office received a communication from the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, that also complained about the union's demand for a ceasefire in Gaza and in particular the actions of Local 7902 in support of same. Instead of doing what your office should have done, which is to simply have advised that the issue was outside of its jurisdiction and provide the communication to the UAW's compliance officer, your office took 2 inappropriate steps well outside its jurisdiction. Now, I have an extra detail to add to this. The call from Borofsky came the night before Fain was scheduled to join a press conference the next morning of Thursday, December 14th on Capitol Hill, joining members of Congress in calling for a ceasefire. That a federal court monitor would think it was remotely appropriate to try to stop that event from happening is totally extraordinary. That is absolutely nowhere within his court-appointed power. Now, as for the 2 inappropriate things Borofsky did after getting that ADL letter, the first wrong step was writing back to the ADL saying they had expressed, quote, very serious concerns that he would personally bring to the UAW board, even though he acknowledged at the time it was outside the scope of his power. The second inappropriate step was to personally write to the board, pressuring them on the Gaza question. Borofsky wrote on February 15th, attached and below is a communication sent to the monitor's hotline by the ADL regarding a statement issued by Local 7902. Although this issue is outside of the monitor's jurisdiction, we thought it was important to forward the message to the IEB given the serious concerns raised here. For what it's worth, as I previously shared with Shawn, similar concerns were raised directly to me shortly after the IEB issued its own ceasefire statement. I am also attaching the Local 7902 president's response. The UAW lawyer responded to Borofsky on Friday, February 23rd, with the email I'm reading from now. The monitor was appointed in 2021 by Federal District Court Judge David M. Lawson. Now, I reached out to Lawson's chambers for comment after business hours yesterday, and we'll follow up today and we'll report back with anything we hear. So on February 29th, just a few days after the UAW sent its letter to Borofsky complaining about his improper lobbying, Borofsky sent the UAW a sweeping demand for documents, saying he was opening an investigation into Fain over a dispute Fain had with the Secretary-Treasurer. That letter was made public in a court filing Borofsky made on Tuesday. He also asked for, quote, and listen to this, any and all emails, text messages, and instant messages sent between any one or more of the following individuals or between any one of the individuals below and any other UAW personnel from the date range of February 12th, 2024 through February 23rd, 2024. He included in the list Fain, his top deputies, and Fain's lawyers. That covers pretty much the exact time the UAW and Borofsky were jockeying over the ADL complaint involving their call for a ceasefire. Borofsky has only upped the attack on Fain since then. The Wall Street Journal reported yesterday, quote, a federal watchdog appointed to monitor the United Auto Workers' internal operations is probing new allegations against President Shawn Fain, including that he made demands to benefit his domestic partner and her sister, according to a court filing Monday. Except that's not exactly accurate. The actual complaint was made by Rich Boyer, who Fain ousted from his job. It's included in an exhibit attached to the Borofsky court filing. So follow this closely. Boyer, in his complaint, says, quote, I submit that Brother Fain's May 29, 2024 reassignment action, basically his firing, was void in that it was taken by Brother Fain in retaliation for my refusal to accede to demands by Brother Fain and his agents that I take actions involving the Stellantis assignment that would have benefited Brother Fain's domestic partner and her sister, and that would have violated the UAW ethical practices codes, financial practices, and or the UAW agreed to consent decree entered by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, unquote. So that's from Boyer's complaint. Now, the difference between to benefit, as the Journal described it, and would have benefited is not just grammatical. The details of what happened aren't known yet. But if Fain pushed for a broad policy or negotiation tactic that would have benefited many people, and among those are his partner and his sister, that's different than Fain asking for specific favors for his partner and his sister. But hey, look, maybe Neil Barofsky is really onto something here, and he's got Fain on this one. But given that he has so flagrantly violated his mandate, it's hard to merely take his word for it. And so, Emily, it's a pretty extraordinary series of events going on here. And there's kind of two things that we could talk about here. One is the question of whether the UAW should weigh in at all on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that's a live debate that is had inside the union and outside the union. And the Republicans at the hearing had a very firm position on that.
It's a hugely important question for the UAW.
The other question is, should a court-appointed federal monitor be going in and telling the UAW, what it can and can't do when it comes to political issues? And that is quite clearly no. It's not even a gray area.
And I have thoughts on both of those. Just really quickly on the first one, it is true if you look at polling that one of the reasons, especially those kind of blue-collar, working-class, Obama-Trump voter type demographic, why they resist organized labor right now. And the UAW, obviously, this is significant for them because they're coming out of this massive years-long corruption scandal, and Shawn Fain was supposed to be the beacon of light, and so they're sensitive, as they should be, to this right now. But one of the big reasons is they don't want to contribute to basically overly political organizations. They just want to be represented. They want their interests as workers to be represented.
Right.
That's what they want to pay dues for.
They want to raise, they want, better scheduling, better health care.
Which clashes with the increasing membership from grad students and all of those sort of more white-collar journalists, all those groups. But also there's always been tension between the ideological sort of Marxist, organized labor, internationalist perspective and people outside of that. So I think it's an important and interesting question for the UAW. The Neil Barofsky part of this, I'm so curious to talk more about with you because we mentioned this when that Detroit news story first broke. Not a lot of coverage of it at the time because it's such a weird story. But Neil Barofsky, he's sort of known in media circles for what he did in 2008.
Yeah,
he's kind of a leftist, sort of adjacent almost, right, to leftist circles because of that.
He was basically a strong ally of Elizabeth Warren during the Wall Street bailout. He was in a similar role to this, where he was kind of the independent monitor of the Wall Street funds. And
at Treasury, right?
And the bankers actually, and how the Treasury was handling them. Yeah.
Right.
And so basically the monitor of the bailout, and the banks hated him.
Yeah.
And I remember writing lots of great stories about Neil Barofsky. This is not to say that Neil Barofsky is like a bad dude or anything.
It's just so interesting.
It is very interesting, but it's just wildly outside of his scope to be called. Also, there's no such thing. We were talking with producer Mac about this before the show. There's no such thing as a personal call from your boss like that.
It's weird.
Like, this is a guy who has access to like the entire communications of the UAW and has this vast, unchecked, court-appointed power over the UAW. So when he calls the night before you're about to have a press conference with Cori Bush and Squad and Rokan and others calling for a ceasefire, and he says, I don't think you should do this. Just personally, just between friends here. Yeah. Do what you want to do. It's impossible to be on the receiving end of that call and not have the power dynamic implicated, as the lawyer said. And he went ahead with it anyway. And then for him 2 months later to then forward on the ADL letter to the executive board, mention the call that he had, so it confirms it, so we don't have to take Fain's word for it, and say that it's raising very serious concerns. And then just weeks later open this fairly trivial investigation into what is a dispute between the president and the secretary-treasurer over organizing tactics. And any dispute between Fain and others inside the union right now over organizing tactics, to me, ought to be decided in Fain's favor, because Fain is out there like delivering historic gains for workers. Like that's his job. He's getting massive contracts. Just this week in the Lehigh Valley, BMW workers won a massive new contract, like 33% raises, like 11% instant raises. Like, he's delivering for workers in a way that like no UAW president has before. So if he was beefing with somebody internally saying that they weren't doing a good enough job,
Yep.
Like he's the guy delivering.
And why is Borovsky, what is your explanation for why Borovsky is carrying that torch?
I mean, Borovsky has long been an outspoken supporter of Israel.
It's just an ideological.
I think it's just he was shocked and appalled that the UAW would weigh in like this. So at the hearing yesterday, it was largely focused on a UAW local. So this is now a coordinated attack. And to your point, it was more white collar. It's the public interest lawyers who had were doing some organizing for the ceasefire resolution. And
Interesting.
The union basically of public interest lawyers. But at the same time, as the lawyer reminded Borovsky in that email, and I'll publish the full email at dropsitenews.com later today, as the lawyer reminded Borovsky, the UAW has a very, very long tradition of engaging in this sort of political activity.
Oh, of course.
Not just apartheid South Africa. The March of Jobs for Justice, Martin Luther King's March on Washington, was completely financed, basically, by the UAW. And if you go back and look at photos from that March on Washington, you'll see UAW signs everywhere. And it's all about wages and freedom and the linking of those two things together. And nobody would say that the UAW was wrong to do that because the civil rights movement was a boon to its members. Like even just from a narrow, discrete, if you don't even want to say it's the moral thing to do, from a narrow, discrete member benefit thing, it was better to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act for its members.
And the Republicans in that hearing, so that was Bob Good, who actually, his election results have been certified that his opponent won in the last couple of days.
He had Trump support, right? But this was a big...
The opponent had Trump support.
The opponent had Trump support. But Good was a Freedom Caucus guy,
DeSantis.
Right?
Yeah, he's a Freedom Caucus guy, yeah.
I knew that he was caught up in that drama.
And he had voted to oust McCarthy, so it was a McCarthy revenge endorsement on the other side. But Republicans are increasingly aware that there's a divide they can exploit. And if they do it successfully, they can sort of, on the one hand, undercut organized labor while also bringing people over to Donald Trump. That's the calculation in their head, or bring people over to the Republican Party. Now, whether people actually start voting Republican beyond Donald Trump is a huge open question, because guess what? John Fetterman won the Pennsylvania Senate seat. Tammy Baldwin doing great in Wisconsin. Whether that's durable beyond just Donald Trump is a huge open question. And that's why you see this interest, this peaked interest from Republicans.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that Republicans are walking a fine line with Shawn Fain personally, because he has delivered such huge gains and is so massively popular with workers right now that, like, if you, in that hearing yesterday, all of their fire was trained at these public interest lawyers and not at Shawn Fain. Now, Borovsky has a personal beef directly with Shawn Fain, but Borovsky's not running for re-election. He's not trying to win the affection of workers. He's jockeying with Shawn Fain.
Right. But
Republicans do seem sensitive to the idea that they're not really going to paint Shawn Fain as like the woke problem. That the workers are strongly behind Fain. But maybe you can drive a wedge between like grad students and public interest lawyers and auto workers. Although I'm not so sure, because if Fain is maybe long-term, but Fain right now is extraordinarily popular. But with a drip of Wall Street Journal articles saying that he's under federal investigation for this, federal investigation for that. And this one is like a classic example. You see the headline and you see the first paragraph, and it says that he did things to benefit his partner and her sister. You're like, what things? Oh, you don't say. And then you look at the actual complaint, it's like, well, he did things that would have benefited them. Well, what does that mean? It's like saying Trump wanted a tax cut to benefit himself or to benefit his daughter and his son-in-law. Well, they benefited from it, but no, he did the tax cut to benefit all the rich people in the country, not just them.
Interesting. This is a crazy story.
Yeah. And we've got a separate crazy story that actually was in Semaphore. Just to do this real quick. So yesterday, if you remember, Jeremy Scahill and I were on Breaking Points to talk about his reporting on a bunch of interviews that he did with Hamas officials. He was also on Democracy Now! with Amy Goodman. So Democracy Now! Then clipped his interview and posted it both to Instagram and to TikTok. Dropsite News also posted it to Instagram. Instagram took it down in both places. Semaphore got a comment from Instagram finally by the end of the day saying that it was a mistake. But Democracy Now! Put it up several different times, and each time it would get taken down until they finally, so they took out a little carrot. And they took this red carrot out, and I think that's what got it to stay up. But so we're going to just quickly play this element, which is, this is the exact clip of Jeremy Scahill speaking to Amy Goodman, which Instagram took off. Here it is on TikTok.
I've spent the past couple of months talking with officials from Hamas, some of them on background, some of them on the record. I also just returned from a reporting trip to the region, and I'm going to be doing more reporting in the coming days on this. But I think it's important to emphasize that October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. You know, often when American officials talk about what Hamas refers to as Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, it's characterized as Hamas shattered the peace. The reality is that for 76 years, there has been no true peace for the Palestinian people in general, and certainly not for the people of Gaza. The primary motivation, Hamas members told me, was to try to shatter the status quo on Gaza. While the fact remains that an enormous number of Palestinians have been slaughtered with U.S. weapons in this genocidal war, the insurgency, the armed groups, Islamic Jihad and Hamas, have waged a war of attrition against Israeli occupation forces. They've killed a large number of Israeli troops. They've blown up tanks. Despite the fact that they're characterized as rats hiding in tunnels, they've proven very effective at delivering serious blows to the Israeli occupation forces. I don't think that there can really be any reasonable debate about whether or not the Palestinians have a right to resist. This is a tactical question. Should Hamas have been able to predict that the response from Israel was going to be far beyond any of the other recent bombing campaigns? And I heard different answers from people within Hamas. Some said, look, we knew that it was going to be a heavy response. We knew that a lot of people were going to die. This is the nature of how Israel responds to our legitimate resistance. But we did not imagine that it was going to be more than kind of what happened in 2014 or 2021, but maybe on some steroids. But there were other officials that said no one within Hamas predicted that it was going to be this scale of a genocidal war. So there isn't necessarily a party line on this. I got the sense that this is a question also that Hamas itself is debating, because there are going to be people that are going to confront them with these questions within Gaza itself. What is clear right now is that this is the moment when the world needs to address in a definitive way the demands by Palestinians for decades to have an independent, unified Palestinian state.
And so when that was taken down by Instagram, it was replaced by a note that said that it, quote, it goes against our community guidelines on dangerous individuals and organizations, unquote. The CIA director, William Burns, is heading to Cairo now to meet with officials at Hamas to negotiate toward a ceasefire. If U.S. officials are able to meet with Hamas, you would think that U.S. journalists should be able to interview them and post it. Now, they did climb down and said, oh, that was a mistake. So, good. Well, let's take them at that.
So what did you mean by you're talking about the red triangle?
So if you noticed, there was one moment where, so there's this upside down carrot, red carrot, that is used in basically all Hamas kind of combat videos, which they'll pause the video, it'll be a carrot on, say, a tank, so that the viewer can focus on what's about to happen, and then you'll see an RPG. So basically so that is my guess, is that
the AI flagged that.
That something automatically flagged.
That's possible.
And it's interesting if that would be news if it's true that Instagram has now, because that carrot has now become kind of symbolic with edgelord kind of supporters of Hamas rather than defenders of like Palestinian rights generally, but people who are like actively like, yay, go Qassam brigades, like that carrot is becoming their kind of symbol. So that's my guess, but like this is what we have to do with algorithms and big tech platforms, is we just sit here and we paw around in the dark guessing at what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say in order to get the news out there.
Yes, and our next guest has actually defended tech limiting the freedom of reach. Although he's here to talk about Joe Biden. That'd be Brian Stelter. So maybe we'll have time for some extra questions because he wrote an op-ed in Vox about how the media got the Biden story wrong, how the media got the Biden story right. Actually, it's sort of a provocative argument. So we're going to chat with him about all of that next.
Yeah, one of the most high-profile media reporters of our generation. Up next, Brian Stelter.
That's right.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.